Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to today's webinar on tips and techniques to protect your video content. My name is Shivashish, and I'll be your host for this insightful session today, which is dedicated to a discussion on the power of streaming and how we can follow some simple and easy steps that we can deploy to our live streaming platforms and make them secure. Before we get started with the presentation, let me give you a quick overview of Muvi, and this should take a couple of minutes. So, established in 2011 and headquartered in Virginia, Muvi was founded with a vision to disrupt the global streaming market. Muvi offers a diverse range of streaming products that cater to businesses of all shapes and sizes. So, whether you are a small business or a large enterprise, our scalable and flexible product portfolio can adapt to all your streaming needs. From comprehensive OTT platforms to fast channels, from on demand streaming to live streaming, and from audio streaming to video streaming, are and deploying websites to apps for mobile and TV ecosystems. Movie has a solution for all your streaming needs, and this can be accomplished with just a few clicks without any coding language. Our flagship product, Movie Live, has been awarded as the #1 OTT platform on G2, a trusted software review platform. And additionally, our live streaming product, Movie Live, was also honored as the best live streaming product of 2022 by the readers of the Streaming Media magazine. Now, as streaming platforms continue to grow in popularity, ensuring the security of our video content has become paramount. Video piracy is a significant concern, causing substantial financial losses for content creators and platform owners alike. At the NAB show this week, Parks Associates announced that by the end of 2027, there will be a cumulative loss to piracy amounting to over 113 billion US dollars for streaming video providers to US consumers. The international research firm's latest forecast also reveals that the piracy rates for US streaming services and film and television programming are expected to rise from its current 22% as measured in 2022 to about 24.5% in 2027. Today, keeping video platforms secure is therefore crucial for business. And as we delve into this critical topic to explore effective strategies for safeguarding video content, I'm delighted to introduce our esteemed guest, Mr. Jason Thibeault, CEO of SVTA. The Streaming Video Alliance is the international technical association focused on solving critical challenges in delivering a better streaming video experience at scale. In this role, he leads the growth and strategy of the organization, as well as the missions of the SVTA to anyone who stays around long enough to listen. He's also the co-founder of a big data startup, DataZoom.io, and is working on several other creative and technology-driven projects. Before SVTA, Jason spent 8 years at Limelight Networks, a leading CDN, where he held several roles, including a senior director of marketing strategy. Jason is an inventor on multiple technical patents in the streaming industry and is a proven entrepreneur. He is also a contributing editor to the very popular Streaming Media magazine. Welcome to the webinar, Jason. We are honored to have you on board, and I'm sure our audience is excited to listen to you. But before we get started with the presentation, there's a small note for the audience. You can keep posting your questions in the Q&A box, and Jason will answer them towards the end of this presentation. Over to you, Jason.
Fantastic. Thanks you, Shivashish. All right. Obviously, the title of this presentation is Keep It Secure, Keep It Safe. So tips and techniques to protect your video content. One of the things that the SVTA does is we have technical groups that create best practices, specifications, and documents to address some of these technical challenges. One of our groups is a security group. They recently published a document, which was the OTT Security Checklist. And this document is a repository, really, of a huge amount of insight into the streaming technology flow in terms of security and in terms of traffic, and an alignment of things that need to be done, are recommended, and are optional in terms of where things should be secured and how things should be protected along these flows. You're going to see a QR code on all of my slides. And if you go to that QR code, that's going to take you straight to that document where you can download it. There's no cost for that. But that's really what I recommend that you do. Is a lot of the material coming out of this presentation is directly from that document. Again, that security group, which features quite a number of very, very well-known people in the streaming industry space around security, is just a huge repository of information regarding how to build a security approach, which is really what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so with that said, let's kick it off. This is just kind of a recap here of what Shivashish just went over in his intro. Piracy is growing, theft is growing, and as a matter of fact, there's people in the industry who feel that these numbers are actually smaller than what Parks and Associates published, and it's really important to understand that. Excuse me. This is not an easily quantifiable problem. And the issue is because some theft is really not even understood or known that it's happening, right? So streaming operators, streaming platforms are out there delivering content, and they might not even be aware that theft is happening. So even though these numbers are shocking, right? 113 billion by 2027, 24.5% of revenue by 2027, 700 million in ad fraud. Like, these numbers are not trivial, but they probably only represent the tip of the iceberg, which is why it is so critical for streaming operators and platform operators to build an effective, what we'll call security strategy or security plan. So when we talk about security, we have to look at two primary parallel paths. It's attack and protection, right? So there are things that need to be protected within the security workflow, within the streaming workflow, things like content, right? So we need to make sure that we encrypt our content. We need to make sure that only the right people have access to that content. But we also need to protect the network. So where is that content stored? Is it being delivered out of CDNs? Is the origin protected? Is the corporate network where the original assets are stored protected? I think we all probably remember there have been numerous announcements and issues coming out about companies like Sony, having network intrusion and losing the actual protection of the original assets. That happened, a number of years ago. It's happened multiple times since with other companies. So the corporate network is actually very important to protect in addition to the streaming network. And then, of course, there's the player, right? So we need to be able to protect the player. That is probably where the most piracy happens, is at the player, because it's the place that is easiest for pirates to attack, right? It is something that they can download, they can access, they can reverse engineer. So protecting the player is really critical. On the other side, right, there's lots of vectors for attack from a pirate. So for example, there's the CDN. There's a lot of interest right now within the streaming industry around CDN leeching. And that is the problem where pirates are actually pulling streams from the CDN. So the streaming operator is paying not only for their own delivery, they're paying for the delivery of the pirate streams, and the pirate is generating revenue off of that. So it's kind of like a double whammy. There's obviously hacking, right? So again, through social engineering or other means, pirates gain access to corporate networks, and they can steal assets that are on the network themselves. And of course, once that's done, it's really hard to pull that back, as the asset being unencrypted is out in the wild. And then there's, of course, decryption, right? So pirates are constantly on the attack against different ways that streaming operators encrypt their content, whether it's using DRMs or, or other means or methods to encrypt the content. The pirates are constantly pushing against that envelope to figure out how to decrypt. And again, back to the hacking issue, if there are unsecured assets like, a user's laptop, and there happen to be keys available on those, then the pirate now has access to those keys, and it's much easier to decrypt the content. So again, there's lots of ways to protect and elements in any protection, and there's lots of vectors by which pirates try to attack the streaming operator and the content in order to gain access to that. So kind of look at it, look at security as sort of a puzzle. There are, of course, many methods that you can use to protect content. And I think we've come to the conclusion by this point in the industry that there's no silver bullet, and that there's really not just one type of security that's going to protect you. As I'll explain when we go through this presentation, you really need to build a plan that addresses all of those different things that need to be protected, as well as all of the different attack vectors. So if we just look at a few of these, right? For content, for example, you can use watermarking or fingerprinting, which can be used to identify who the original owner of the content was, that was pirated. Obviously, we know that encryption through DRM is used, extensively throughout the industry. But then there are also other means and methods like CDN tokens, right? So ensuring that individual streams are authorized. And then there's, of course, the simplest is user authentication, right? So somebody has to log in to actually view the content or access the content. And that really then determines what rights do they have to it. So again, it's important when you think about security and your approach to securing streaming content. It's not just a one size fits all, and it's not just a use this method, you're good, you'll stop all the pirates. It is really a combination of things. And that's where, again, back to the OTT Streaming Security Checklist that was put out by the security group in the SVTA, that's how they really approached it, understanding that there are multiple elements across multiple vectors that need to be addressed in order to more comprehensively protect those content assets. Of course, protection is really dependent upon not only the content type, but also the business model, right? So obviously, when you're talking about free-to-air content, there's going to be a lot less security involved there. But when you talk about FAST, even though there's a low security level for the content itself, the provider really has to protect those streams because of advertising, right? So if those streams are being delivered somewhere else, and those impressions are counting against what they have contractually obligated to, but they're not receiving those impressions themselves, then the problem becomes is they're not receiving all of the money that they can be for ads. So they're losing ads, so that ad fraud issue. So even though the content doesn't necessarily need to be secured very intently, the access means to the streams do. But then you can obviously go all the way down the list to things like premium live TV or events, right? Those are so worth so much money. And of course, that probably the biggest example of that is sports rights. We know that those rights that that sports owners are selling to the streaming operators are in the billions of dollars. And so when these streaming operators purchase those rights, they really have to protect that investment. And doing so requires, again, understanding that puzzle and making sure that they've got all the pieces in place to have a comprehensive security approach. And of course, there is that sort of what is acceptable loss. It would be great if it was zero, right? If there was going to be zero theft. But even we understand in the retail world, that's not the case. No matter how you secure your retail premises, there is always going to be some leakage. There's always going to be some product that leaves without getting paid for. And so there's always an acceptable amount of loss. Right now, the loss is way, way beyond acceptable. And so the ultimate goal is to tighten up all of those security controls so that the acceptable loss becomes something that is a bit more acceptable. So one of the things that came out of this document that the SVTA Security Group did was really understanding how the flow happens between the services. So here you have, a request from a user coming into an origin or a CDN, the request getting processed and going back out through the workflow. So there's a flow of traffic, but there's also a flow of content, right? So when content gets mastered, it gets produced, it gets moved down the pipeline, and it's edited, it's packaged, it's formatted, it's encoded, it's DRM'd. That content workflow is important to protect as well. So one of the things that the group did as they worked through this process was to identify these two flows. How does the content flow from creation to playback? So that's fantastic. And then what is the flow of the traffic when requesting that content, right? Comes from the device, again, back up through the network and then returning, to the user with that content in tow. And so when we think about this flow, it's important to note that each of these areas, as you can see, they're all numbered, relates to security controls. So if you just look at a few of these in the table, for example, if you look at playback control, some examples might be playback authorization, right? Is the player authorized? Is the user authorized? On geo restrictions, so understanding the geo checks, right? Is the person in a region that has rights for that content? And then how to block that person? Is a VPN being used? And if so, how to prevent the user from watching that content if they're going to be employing a VPN. Things like application security, right? Application hardening and legacy management. So deprecating old versions of applications and replacing them with newer versions when those versions come out. So there's lots of different controls that are available to each of these aspects of the content workflow and the service traffic workflow. And that sort of gets to this really kind of big issue, which is that there's a lot of variables to consider. And that's what really makes this document so powerful and important, is it's really kind of the first time that that people in the industry have come together and taken a comprehensive look at those two flows to understand really what are all the vectors, what are all the variables. And it can be overwhelming as, let's say, a streaming operator to think about that yourself. Like, oh, what are all the places we need to protect? Are we protecting them all? Are all of those things that we need to protect, are they critical to protect or just optional? Like, do we really need to do that? Is that based on our business model, which is also a reflection of our content type? You can see that the post-it notes here, it's a great illustrative example of how many variables would need to be considered. And this document really represents that first pass at trying to comprehensively look at all of them. So just giving you an example of how this document works a little bit, if you take DRM, for example, and so I think DRM was, number 6 on the list. These elements to the right, so DRM security policy, DRM selection, those are like the groups of controls within DRM. So you can see that it's not just good enough to think about, oh, we need DRM. Okay, check, we have DRM. There are lots of elements related to DRM, like content encryption keys, like license requests, license responses, that need to be addressed with certain controls. And so if you look to the right, then again, these are some of the critical controls. And I'll kind of talk about that in a second of the differentiation between critical and non-critical. But if you look at some of these, right? So DRM selection, for example, premium content requires hardware protected DRMs, right? That's really important. And so again, it's not just an issue of who's our DRM provider? Oh, let's go with Widevine, or should we use, Fairplay if we're going to deliver to Apple? What should we, we just get a couple of DRM. Let's just use EasyDRM. It's a great provider, fantastic. They'll give us everything we need. But there are other considerations to take into account, and it's important to have these conversations with such a DRM partner, right? To be able to say, like, hey, can you guys block DRM clients that have been revoked by you guys? Can we make sure that this process happens? How do we ensure that process? That if you guys have revoked, a certificate, that client then can't use that certificate. So it's important to understand that this is where it gets really into the weeds. It's not just about big categories to build your puzzle. It's about all of the little pieces that fit together to make a comprehensive security plan. And that's sort of what I was talking about, is this, you can't do everything, right? It's really not feasible to address every single piece of security, especially when it's not going to result in any meaningful impact on a reduction of theft or piracy. So it's important that's why this document, it labels and identifies those things that are critical, right? So the recommendation from the security group and from all the people, I think it was probably 15 or 18 industry people that were involved in these, some from very big security vendors and folks from, content platform operators and people from very, very well-known consulting companies. They came together and said, these are the critical things that people need to address. And there are recommended things. Hey, this would be great if you did address this. It's not super important, but, we're recommending that you probably look at them, again, in relation to your business model, in relation to your content type. And then, of course, there are these kind of aspirational, like if you really, really, really have resources to do this and you want to make sure that you have everything secured that you possibly can, then you can tackle these aspirational things as well. And what I've done here is I've just captured which of those categories has critical elements. And as you can see, there are only 2 that don't have any critical elements, but plenty of recommended elements. So obviously the CDN is a big topic right now within the industry around security. Again, that's really related to CDN leaching. That is not necessarily something that a content operator can control, right? Unless they're operating their own CDN. So there are folks like, for example, NBC Universal, who's part of Comcast. Comcast operates their own CDN for their ISP subscribers, and that's fantastic. And so Comcast might have some more critical to-dos in the CDN category list because they are a CDN. So CDN leaching is something that's being handled and being addressed by the CDNs, and that's something that they must do. And so from a content owner perspective who's looking to secure their service traffic flow and their content workflow, the CDN has a lot of recommended tasks to do to help secure things, but nothing that's critical. But all of these other areas, things like registration, user management, all of them have elements that really need to be addressed, because without addressing them, they leave an open vector. So it's kind of like, you've got a puzzle, but you've got this piece missing and you're never going to be able to complete the puzzle because that piece is just not there. So all of these pieces together form that security plan. And that's what's really important for companies to think about as they're starting to consider, what do I need to secure? So back to this sort of building your security approach, this is really what this is about, right? The tips and techniques that are addressed in this document are very tangible and very tactical. The key is to approach it as a security plan. So the question should be like, okay, how do I build my security plan? What do we need to secure, and how do we need to go about securing it? So the key thing, the first one, is to identify the elements that are critical to your flows, right? So again, if you are a fast channel provider, you're going to be thinking differently than if you are a premium content provider. So let's look at, your Pluto TV versus a DAZN. So you have two different content types there, two different approaches to security. So it's important to look at this flow and say, like, okay, what do we need to secure based on our content type and our business model? So again, you map those elements to what you're serving. And there may be providers out there who, like, let's take Hulu, for example, in the US, who's serving a combination of high value and lower value content. So it's really important for them to look at the security approach as it applies to the different content types. That's really kind of what will help them develop a security approach that will, again, mitigate as much as possible the theft that might be happening, for their content. The next thing, once you have that sort of, we'll call it a map of elements to content types, is to build your security checklist. And that's where the document comes in place. And just notice that little QR code down in the corner. It's to grab that checklist and look at those items that apply to the elements that you've selected. And then once you do that, right, once you have the checklist, it's time to implement, right? It's time to go through processes, procedures, and technology stacks to ensure that you're able to check those elements off. But it's not just a one and done, right? So pirates are not stopping. They're not going to be like, oh, darn, they blocked us. We'll just give up. That's not the way it works, right? Pirates are constantly pushing and checking, and they're working on, every time a new security approach comes into play, they're looking at how to beat it. And so that security checklist and that implementation needs to be consistently reviewed and updated. And of course, that has to take into effect looking at log files and then analyzing, what leakage or what theft is happening, to make sure that the security measures that are being put in place and the security approaches that are being addressed are in fact having a meaningful difference. So again, I really, invite you to visit the SVTA website and grab the document. We are working actually to make this a more interactive online tool so that folks can come to a web page and they can say, this is my type of content, or this is my job responsibility. I'm level 1 support, I'm ops eng, I'm in charge of security, and be able to get a checklist that's a bit more customized, because again, there are hundreds of checklist items related to those different elements and aspects of security. And it's very important that that you implement those elements that are important to you or necessary for your business model, because just looking at the checklist and saying, oh, wow, we have to implement all of these, can be, catastrophically overwhelming. So it's important to strategically prioritize those checklist items, determine which are appropriate for, again, content type and business model, and then go about a way of implementing them that operationalizes that process so that they can be reviewed on a quarterly basis. Data can be looked at to ensure that the security is still not only applicable, but working as intended, and then make adjustments as needed. All right, so thank you for that. That was, I hope you guys enjoyed that and appreciated it. Again, a lot of that content comes out of that document. And it doesn't make sense for me to just go through, all of the checklist items, because that would probably bore you to death. And it would be totally against what I just talked about, which is finding the checklist items that are applicable to your content type and business. But with that said, let's turn to, can you please come back previous slide for 2 seconds? So I'm not quite sure what slide that was. But we can go back to, I'm probably going to guess it was that slide. And so if we have anybody who has questions about this slide or any of the other slides, please, I'll give you a minute or so to ask those questions. Again, this is probably one of the most important elements of the document because it represents this plan that people, before slide. Okay, we'll go back one. Yeah, I mean, this is also an important slide in understanding, again, the security levels to content types. This is also straight from the document, so you can find this in the document as well. Well, if we don't have any other questions, that's all right. Again, a lot of your questions can probably be answered by going to the website and downloading that document and taking a look at it. We're going to be doing lots of work with this document throughout the year. It's extremely valuable content, and we hope that presentations like this will give people the impetus to go grab that document and really look at how they build their own security plan, and all of those checklist items then that need to be addressed, which would be customized for their plan. It's such an eye-opening thing to understand that, again, back to this diagram, this is not a just put your finger in this hole in the dam to stop all the theft. There's lots of cracks in the dam, and you're going to need lots of fingers. And so to do that is to really understand, where you're vulnerable, where your business is vulnerable, where your streaming platform really needs to have security addressed. And it could be everywhere from, again, that corporate network, all the way down to that player. All right, again, with that said, again, thank you very much. I enjoyed this. And again, I hope you learned at least one thing, which is that you need to build a plan. And those plans are unique to your company based on your content type and your business model. And that this document that the SVTA has published, the OTT Security Checklist, can help you create something actionable to secure the content that needs to be secured within your streaming platform. And I will turn it back over to Shivashish.
Thank you so much, Jason. We have a couple of questions that's coming from our
Oh,
LinkedIn page. Okay, so
perfect.
the first one is, how does this CDN leaching directly impact my content? It's coming from Rohan.
Yeah. So, CDN leaching, again, if you're delivering content out of CDNs, there's no definitive proof. Again, CDNs are very, very focused on security, right? So they're trying to ensure that the streams that are coming from them to end users are secured, and the access to those streams are secured as well. Things happen, right? So it can affect your content. It may be not affecting it at all, it may be affecting it a lot. It might depend on how you're securing the access to your streams to your CDN. So there are just lots of different ways that you can look at your own content workflow to understand how are we protecting our streams? We're making sure we're using HTTPS. We're making sure that we're using tokens. We're making sure that the tokens are protected. So there's lots of things that you can do as a content owner to ensure your use of the CDN is secured, and more importantly, that your CDN is implementing and using security methods to ensure that the content can't be accessed by unauthorized users.
I hope this answers your question. So the next question, this is the last one, Jason. This comes from Mark, and he wants to know that as a platform owner, as a OTT platform owner, what is the first step towards making your content more secure?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, where do you start? It's funny. I would probably say that you start with the content itself. So we need to make sure that that's secured, that that's encrypted on the network, that access to the content on the network is secured. So that protects the content assets itself. Then once that content moves from, let's say, that storage into an origin where it can be delivered, it's important to protect the player. It's important to protect the access rights to that content. So now we're talking about DRM. We're talking about user authentication and registration. So these are sort of, when you talk about the basics, right? Ensuring that the content is protected is probably the number one thing that needs to be done first, because that will protect you even if the content gets loose. It's encrypted, right? So that is probably the first and foremost thing that needs to get done. And then, of course, there are lots of other elements that need to be addressed to ensure that data is secure, that passwords are secure, things of that nature to make sure that access to the content is protected. So you protect the content, and you protect the access to it. And then there are lots of other things, deep down below that, that the document covers in terms of checklist items. But that is definitely what I would recommend. First is, ensuring that the content itself and where it sits is protected. If it gets out into the wild, if for some reason it's stolen, it can't be accessed because it's encrypted and it's protected.
I hope this answers your question, Mark. This concludes our session for this day. I would like to thank Jason on behalf of Muvi for taking out time and being a part of this webinar. Thank you so much, Jason.
Oh, you're welcome.
And to all our audiences, Muvi keeps conducting monthly webinars on interesting industry topics and showcases some of Muvi's best offerings. I would personally request all of our viewers to keep a lookout for our social media channels and our website for a registration link for the upcoming webinar. Now, the upcoming webinar is going to happen on 8th of May. And the topic for the webinar is Muvi's application scalability insights. So it will be conducted by Tanmay Biswal, who is the Director of Engineering, Intranet, Extranet, and Integrations. And the registrations for the same are live on our LinkedIn as well as on our website. As a small token of appreciation, we would like to give you out an informative brochure to be read later. You can get a link to that from the comment section of your webinar. So thank you so much for attending this webinar. See you again. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.